Van Helsing vs. Dracula. More than 130 years ago, a book was published that was, and still is, considered to be one of the finest novels ever written. Bram Stoker's Dracula is the story of a charming and charismatic vampire who can attract humans and turn them into vampires, usually by biting them and sucking their blood. His nemesis, Abraham Van Helsing, is an equally interesting character who started as a simple doctor but became the most iconic vampire hunter of all time in his quest to hunt and kill Dracula. Over the years, these two characters have inspired numerous films, TV shows, radio and stage plays, books, comics, animations, and video games. But why is that? What is it about these two characters that have inspired people's imaginations? Come with me now as we take a deep exploration into the world of Van Helsing versus Dracula. Born on the 8th of November 1847, Abraham Stoker was an Irish author, best known today for his gothic horror novel Dracula, published in 1897. But during his lifetime, he was better known as the personal assistant of the actor, Sir Henry Irving. He was also the business manager of the Lyceum Theatre, which Irving owned. His parents were Abraham Stoker, a senior civil servant from Dublin, and Charlotte Thornley from County Sligo. Stoker was the third of 7 children, the eldest of whom was Sir Thornley Stoker. Abraham was confined to bed with an unknown illness until he began school at 7 years old, when he made a complete recovery. Looking back at this time, Stoker wrote, "I was naturally thoughtful, and the leisure of long illness gave opportunity for many thoughts which were fruitful, according to their kind, in later years." After his recovery, he grew up without any more severe illnesses. He even excelled as an athlete at Trinity College Dublin, which he attended from 1864 to 1870. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1870 and pursued his Master of Arts degree in 1875. Although later in life he recalled graduating with honours in mathematics, this appears to have been a mistake. He participated in multiple sports, including playing rugby for Dublin University, and he was named University Athlete. He was auditor of the College Historical Society, known as the HIST, and president of the University Philosophical Society. To this day, he remains the only student in Trinity's history to hold both positions. His first paper was on sensationalism in fiction and society. While he was a student, Stoker became interested in the theatre thanks to his friend Dr. Maunsell. While working for the Irish Civil Service, he became the theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail, co-owned by Sheridan Le Fanu, an author of Gothic tales. In those days, theatre critics were held in low esteem, but Stoker attracted notice by the quality of his reviews. In December 1876, he gave a favourable review of Henry Irving's Hamlet, performed at the Theatre Royal in Dublin. Irving invited Stoker for dinner at the Shelbourne Hotel, where he was staying, and they became friends. Stoker also wrote stories, and his book Crystal Cup was published by the London Society in 1872, followed by The Chain of Destiny in 4 parts in the Shamrock newspaper. In 1876, while a civil servant in Dublin, Stoker wrote the non-fiction book The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland, published in 1879. Furthermore, he was interested in art and founded the Dublin Sketching Club in 1879. In 1878, Stoker married Florence Balcombe, the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel James Balcombe. She was a celebrated beauty whose former sweetheart had been Oscar Wilde. Stoker had known Wilde from his student days, having proposed him for membership of the university's Philosophical Society while he was president. Wilde was upset at Florence's decision, but Stoker later resumed their acquaintanceship, and after Wilde's fall from grace, visited him on the continent. The Stokers moved to London, where Bram became the acting manager and then the business manager of Irving's Lyceum Theatre in Covent Garden. He held this post for 27 years. On the 31st of December 1879, Bram and Florence's son, Irving Noel Thornley Stoker, was born. He was to be their only child. The collaboration with Henry Irving was important for Stoker. He became involved in London's high society, where he met James Abbott McNeill Whistler and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, to whom he was distantly related. Working for Irving, the most famous actor of his time, and managing one of the most successful theatres in London, made Stoker a notable man. He was dedicated to Irving, and his memoirs show he idolised him. In London, Stoker also met Hall Caine, who became one of his closest friends. He dedicated the book Dracula to him. Dracula was primarily written in the 1890s. Stoker produced more than 100 pages of notes for the novel, drawing substantially from Transylvanian folklore and history. Some academics have suggested that the character of Dracula was inspired by historical figures, like Vlad the Impaler or the Countess Elizabeth Bathory. There is, however, much disagreement about this, and there is no mention of either figure in Stoker's notes. Whilst on holiday in Whitby, he found Dracula's name in the local public library and chose it because he thought it was the Romanian word for devil. Following its publication, the critics positively received Dracula, who pointed to its effective use of horror. In contrast, reviewers who wrote negatively of the novel regarded it as excessively frightening. Comparisons to other works of Gothic fiction were common, including its structural similarity to Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, published in 1859. In the past century, Dracula has been positioned as a piece of Gothic fiction. Modern scholars explore the novel within the historical context of the Victorian era and discuss its depiction of gender roles, sexuality, and race. Dracula is one of the most famous pieces of English literature. Many of the book's characters have entered popular culture as archetypal versions of their characters. For example, Count Dracula as the quintessential vampire, and Abraham Van Helsing as an iconic vampire hunter. The novel, which is in the public domain, has been adapted for film over 30 times, and its characters have made numerous appearances in virtually all media. As an epistolary novel, Dracula is narrated through a series of documents. The novel's first 4 chapters are written as if they were the private journals of Jonathan Harker. Scholars note that Harker's accounts about the strange events of his visit to Dracula's castle were written as a travelogue, a popular writing style in the 19th century. John Seward, Mina Murray, and Jonathan Harker all keep a crystal clear account of the period as an act of self-preservation. David Seed notes that Harker's narrative is written in shorthand to remain incomprehensible to the Count, protecting his own identity, which Dracula threatens to destroy. Harker's journal, for example, embodies the only advantage during his stay at Dracula's castle, that he knows more than the Count thinks he does. The novel's disparate accounts all interlink as the narrative unfolds. In the first half of the story, each narrator has a strongly characterized narrative voice. Lucy shows her verbosity, Seward shows a businesslike formality, and Harker shows excessive politeness. These narrative styles also highlight the power struggle between the vampire and his hunters. The increasing prominence of Van Helsing's broken English as Dracula gathers power represents the introduction of foreigners into Victorian society. The character of Count Dracula is an undead, centuries-old vampire and a Transylvanian nobleman who claims to be descended from Attila the Hun. He inhabits a decaying castle in the Carpathian Mountains near the Borgo Pass. Unlike the vampires of Eastern European folklore, which are portrayed as repulsive, corpse-like creatures, Dracula is described as handsome and charismatic, with a veneer of aristocratic charm. In his conversations with Jonathan Harker, he reveals that he is deeply proud of his boyar heritage. He has a nostalgia for the past, which he admits has become a mere memory of heroism, honor, and valor in modern times. Details of his early life are undisclosed, but it is mentioned that he was in life a most wonderful man. Soldier, statesman, and alchemist. which latter was the highest development of the scientific knowledge of his time. He had a mighty brain, a learning beyond compare, and a heart that knew no fear and no remorse. There was no branch of knowledge of his time that he did not essay. He studied the black arts at the Academy of Scholomance in the Carpathian Mountains, overlooking the town of Sibiu, also known as Hermannstadt, and has a deep knowledge of alchemy and magic. Taking up arms, as befitting his rank and status as a voivode, he led troops against the Turks across the Danube. According to his nemesis Abraham Van Helsing, he must indeed have been that voivode Dracula who won his name against the Turk over the great river on the very frontier of Turkey land. If it be so, then he was no common man, for in that time and for centuries after, he was spoken of as the cleverest and the most cunning, as well as the bravest of the sons of the land beyond the forest. Dead and buried in a great tomb in the chapel of his castle, Dracula returns from death as a vampire and lives for several centuries in his castle, with 3 terrifyingly beautiful female vampires beside him. Although Dracula dons a mask of friendship early in the novel, he often flies into fits of rage when his plans are frustrated. When Dracula's brides attempt to seduce Jonathan Harker, Dracula physically assaults one and ferociously berates them for their insubordination. He has an appreciation for ancient architecture, and when purchasing a home, he prefers them to be aged, saying a new home would kill me, and that to make a new home habitable to him would take a century. Dracula is very proud of his warrior heritage, proclaiming his pride to Harker on how the Sekali people are infused with the blood of heroes. He also expresses an interest in the history of the British Empire, speaking admiringly of its people. He has a somewhat primal and predatory worldview. He pities ordinary humans for their revulsion to their darker impulses. He is not without human emotions, however, as he often says that he too can love. Though usually portrayed as having a strong Eastern European accent, the original novel only specifies that his spoken English is excellent, though strangely toned. His appearance varies in age. He is described early in the novel as thin, with a long white moustache, pointed ears, and sharp teeth. It is also noted later in the book by a zookeeper who sees him that he has a hooked nose and a pointed beard with a streak of white in it. He is dressed all in black and has hair on his palms. Harker describes him as an old man, cruel-looking and giving an effect of extraordinary pallor. In Chapter 4, Harker writes, "The last I saw of Count Dracula was his kissing his hand to me, with a red light of triumph in his eyes, and with a smile that Judas in hell might be proud of." As the novel progresses, Dracula is described as taking on a more and more youthful appearance. After Harker strikes him with a shovel, he is left with a scar on his forehead, which he bears throughout the novel. Dracula also possesses great wealth, and has Romany people in his homeland who are loyal to him as servants and protectors. Count Dracula is portrayed in the novel using many different supernatural abilities, and is believed to have gained his powers through dealings with the devil. Chapter 18 of the book describes many of the powers, limitations, and weaknesses of vampires, and Dracula in particular. According to Van Helsing, Dracula has superhuman strength, equivalent to 20 strong men. He does not cast a shadow or have a reflection from mirrors. He is immune to conventional means of attack. A sailor tried to stab him in the back with a knife, but the blade goes through his body as though it is air. He can defy gravity to a certain extent, and possesses superhuman agility, able to climb vertical surfaces upside down in a reptilian manner. He can travel onto unhallowed ground, such as the graves of suicides and those of his victims. He has powerful hypnotic, telepathic, and illusionary abilities. He also has the power, within limitations, to vanish and reappear elsewhere at will. He has amassed cunning and wisdom throughout centuries and cannot die by the mere passing of time. He can command animals, such as rats, owls, bats, moths, foxes, and wolves. However, his control over these animals is limited, as seen when the party first enters his house in London. Although Dracula can summon thousands of rats to swarm and attack the group, Holmwood summons his trio of terriers to fight the rats. The dogs prove very efficient rat killers, suggesting they are Manchester Terriers trained for that purpose. Terrified by the dog's onslaught, the rats flee, and Dracula's control over them is gone. Dracula can also manipulate the weather and direct the elements such as storms, fog, and mist. Dracula can change form at will, grow and become small. His featured forms in the novel are a bat, a wolf, a large dog, and a fog or mist. When the moonlight is shining, he can travel as elemental dust within its rays. He can pass through tiny cracks or crevices while retaining his human form, or in the form of vapor, described by Van Helsing as the ability to slip through a hairbreadth space of a tomb door or coffin. This ability is also used by his victim Lucy when she becomes a vampire. When the group breaks into her tomb, they open the sealed coffin to find her corpse is no longer there. One of Dracula's powers is the ability to turn other people into vampires by biting them and drawing their blood. According to Van Helsing, when they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind. And so the circle goes on, ever widening, like as the ripples from a stone thrown in the water. Friend Arthur, if you had met that kiss which you know of before poor Lucy died, or again last night when you open your arms to her, you would in time, when you had died, have become Nosferatu, as they call it in Eastern Europe, and would for all time make more of those undeads that have so filled us with horror. In Dr. Seward's journal he writes, "The vampire itself does not cause death. It is the method vampires use to drain blood of the victim and to increase their influence over them. This is described by Van Helsing. The Nosferatu do not die like the bee when he sting once. He is only stronger, and being stronger, have yet more power to work evil." In chapter 18, he also writes, "Victims who are bitten by a vampire and do not die are hypnotically influenced by them. Those children whose blood she suck are not yet so much worse, but if she live on, undead, more and more lose their blood, and by her power over them they come to her." In Mina Harker's journal, Van Helsing later describes the aftermath of a bitten victim when the vampire has been killed. But if she die in truth, then all cease. The tiny wounds of the throats disappear, and they go back to their plays, unknowing of whatever has been. As Dracula slowly drains Lucy's blood, she dies from acute blood loss, and later transforms into a vampire, despite the efforts of Seward and Van Helsing to provide her with blood transfusions. He is aided by powers of necromancy and divination of the dead, that all who die by his hand may come back to life and do his bidding. Professor Abraham Van Helsing is an aged and highly knowledgeable Dutch doctor with many interests and accomplishments. The character is best known as a vampire hunter and the archenemy of Count Dracula. In the novel, John Seward calls in his former teacher, Professor Van Helsing, to assist with the mysterious illness of Lucy Westenra. Van Helsing's friendship with Seward is based partly on an undisclosed prior event in which Van Helsing suffered a severe wound and Seward saved his life by sucking out the gangrene. Van Helsing first realizes that Lucy is the victim of a vampire, and he guides Seward and his friends in their efforts to save Lucy. According to Leonard Woolf's annotations to the novel, Van Helsing had a son who died. Van Helsing says that his son, had he lived, would have had a similar appearance to Lucy's suitor, Arthur Holmwood. Consequently, Van Helsing developed a particular fondness for Holmwood. Van Helsing's wife went insane from grief after their son's death, but as a Catholic, he refuses to divorce her. He says, "With my poor wife dead to me, but alive by church's law, though no wits, all gone, even I, who am faithful husband to this now, no wife." Van Helsing is one of the few characters in the novel who is fully physically described in one place. In chapter 14, Mina Harker describes him as a man of medium height, strongly built, with his shoulders set back over a broad, deep chest, and a neck well balanced on the trunk as the head is on the neck. The poise of the head strikes me at once as indicative of thought and power. The head is noble, well-sized, broad, and large behind the ears. The face, clean-shaven, shows a hard, square chin, a large, resolute, mobile mouth, a good-sized nose, rather straight, but with quick, sensitive nostrils that seem to broaden as the big, bushy brows come down and the mouth tightens. The forehead is broad and fine, rising at first almost straight, and then sloping back above two bumps or ridges wide apart, such a forehead that the reddish hair cannot possibly tumble over it, but falls naturally back and to the sides. Big, dark blue eyes are set widely apart, and are quick and tender, or stem with the man's moods. Van Helsing's personality is described by John Seaward, his former student, thus: "He is a seemingly arbitrary man. This is because he knows what he is talking about better than anyone else. He is a philosopher and a metaphysician, and one of the most advanced scientists of his day, and he has, I believe, an absolutely open mind. This, with an iron nerve, a temper of the icebrook, and indomitable resolution, self-command and toleration, exalted from virtues to blessings, and the kindliest and truest heart that beats. These form his equipment for the noble work that he is doing for mankind, work both in theory and practice, for his views are as wide as his all-embracing sympathy." In the novel, Van Helsing is described as having a thick foreign accent, in that he speaks in broken English and uses German phrases such as "mein Gott." Adaptations of the novel have tended to exaggerate Van Helsing's role as a vampire expert, which is often depicted as his primary occupation. However, in the novel, Dr. Seaward requests Van Helsing's assistance simply because Lucy's affliction has him baffled, and Van Helsing knows as much about obscure diseases as anyone in the world. Van Helsing is seen using many different tools to aid him and his party in fending off Dracula, warding off vampires, and in general defeating the undead. Skeleton keys were used for lockpicking to open the doors to many of Dracula's lairs located throughout London. A wreath of withered garlic blossoms, a silver crucifix, a sacred wafer brought from Amsterdam contained in an envelope or crushed and sprinkled around him in a circle as a protective barrier, electric lamps that could be attached or secured against the chest, a revolver and a knife for use against enemies weaker than Dracula. The branch of a wild rose could be placed on top of a coffin containing a vampire, thereby immobilizing it. Mountain ash used to repel the undead. A wooden stake and a hammer to pierce a vampire's heart. And a golden crucifix necklace given to Lucy. In the novel, the eponymous vampire has decided to move from Transylvania to London. He summons Jonathan Harker, a newly qualified English solicitor, to provide legal support for a real estate transaction overseen by Harker's employer. Dracula at first charms Harker with his friendliness and historical knowledge, and even rescues him from the clutches of the 3 female vampires in the castle. In truth, however, Dracula merely wishes to keep Harker alive long enough to complete the legal transaction and to learn as much as possible about England. Dracula leaves his castle and boards a Russian ship, the Demeter, taking along with him 50 boxes of Transylvanian soil, which he needs to regain his strength and rest during daylight. During the voyage to Whitby, a coastal town in northern England, he sustains himself by feeding on the ship's crew members. Only one body is later found, the captain, who is tied up to the ship's helm. The captain's log is recovered and tells of strange events that had taken place during the ship's journey. Dracula leaves the ship in the form of a dog and runs up the 199 steps to the graveyard of St. Mary's Church in the shadow of the ruins of Whitby Abbey. Soon the Count begins tormenting Harker's fiancée, Mina Murray, and her friend Lucy Westenra. There is also a notable link between Dracula and Renfield, a patient in the insane asylum overseen by John Seawood, who was compelled to consume spiders, birds, and other creatures in ascending order of size to absorb their life force. Renfield acts as a kind of sensor, reacting to Dracula's proximity and supplying clues accordingly. Dracula visits Lucy's bedchamber on a nightly basis, draining her of blood while simultaneously infecting her with the curse of vampirism. Not knowing the cause for Lucy's deterioration, her three suitors, Seawood, Arthur Holmwood, and Quincy Morris, call upon Seawood's mentor, the Dutch doctor Abraham Van Helsing. Van Helsing soon decides her condition's supernatural origins and tries to keep the vampire at bay with garlic. Nevertheless, Dracula attacks Lucy's house one final time, killing her mother and transforming Lucy into an undead. Harker escapes Dracula's castle and returns to England, barely alive and deeply traumatized. On Seawood's suggestion, Mina seeks Van Helsing's assistance in assessing Harker's health. She reads his journal and passes it along to Van Helsing. This reveals the first clue to the identity of Lucy's assailant, which later prompts Mina to collect all of the events of Dracula's appearances in news articles, saved letters, newspaper clippings, and the journals of each group member. This helps the group investigate Dracula's movements and later discover that Dracula directly influences Renfield's behavior. They then find that Dracula has purchased a residence next door to Seawood's. The group gathers intelligence to track down Dracula and destroy him. After the undead Lucy attacks several children, Van Helsing, Seawood, Holmwood, and Morris enter her crypt and destroy her to save her soul. Later, Harker joins them, and the party work to discover Dracula's intentions. Harker aids the party in tracking down the locations of the boxes